Hi da 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 da. Hi da 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 da. Hi di di da 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 da. Ah da 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 ya da 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 da. Ah da 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 ya da 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 da. Ay, ay, di di da 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 da. Ay, da da da, di di da, ay. Ze do di ve ze re i. 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 Hello everyone, welcome back for another session of the basics of Jewish prayer. Tonight is our sixth and final session of this six-part series. And this series is, of course, brought to you in part by the generosity of the D. Dan, and Betty Kahn Foundation, and as well as the generosity of viewers and prayers like you. So we have our final session tonight of these 6 weeks, and we'll jump right into it. As always, I'll stick around for a bit after 8:30 when we formally wrap, and we can do some informal Q&A, and if anyone has any leftover things they'd like to discuss. Okay, so to start us off, let's just open it up a bit for the next 5 minutes or so. What are some of the questions that you have about what we've talked about and what we haven't talked about? We'll have kind of this open-ended prompt. We do have some content to address tonight, but I'm hoping that we'll also have some space to tackle some extra material that's whatever's on people's minds. So if anyone's got anything at the tip of their tongue, I'd love to hear it. What questions do you have, and about what we've covered or what we haven't covered, or what are you left wondering? Yeah, Victoria, I see your Zoom hand is up.
Just in case I am not the only one who might have this question, I'll pose it now, but you can answer it at any time. When it comes to the daily prayers of a practicing Jew, besides the Shema, what is what else is a daily prayer to, if you're going to start practicing it in seriously?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will answer that now, and give others some time to think for other questions. Um, yeah, so you're correct that the Shema is would be part of your daily prayer practice for Shacharit and Mariv, for morning and evening. And if you recall, when we learned about the three prayer services of the day, each of those is, though there are some elements that are only to be said with a minyan, each of those services would constitute your daily prayer practice. So if you could open up a siddur, if it's for a weekday siddur, and it would have a whole set of prayers in it for shacharit. And the idea would be pretty much that you would start at the beginning of those and go to the end of them. Um, And so what you would cover would be there are the morning blessings that you would say upon arising, getting dressed, getting ready in the morning. Um, and then there are a series of various psalms, the section that's called Pesuke de Zimra. This is all what we talked about under the rubric of being in the warm up. So there would be warm up kind of psalms, various blessings, and things like that. Um, some Sidurim include certain readings. So, for example, within Orthodox Judaism, it's customary and in fact required to uh, read over the laws following the temple sacrifices, the laws of the temple sacrifices, as part of your daily prayer. Is to study these laws, to read them over, recite them, um, and then you would have the Shema and its blessings, the material that accompanies the Shema, and then the Amidah, which would definitely be part of your prayer practice, and then a little bit of closing material, the sort of cool down, to complement the warm up. But at its core, the two real poles of Jewish liturgy are that if you wanted to just start with the most important stuff, to go right to the heart of it, which is what I recommend doing, um, to is to start with Shema and Amidah. Those are the two central poles of the liturgy, um, and so those, yeah, it's a little. It can definitely be confusing because what you see in the Siddur is obviously there's the question like, I'm here by myself. Am I doing the service? And kind of the answer is yes, in a way, yes. That there are certain things that are done differently uh, with the minyan, with the group, but but yeah. So hopefully that adds some clarity. And Shell also echoed this, saying that the basic rungs of the service ladder, Shema, Amidah, Kaddish, and Aleinu. Yep, definitely. Okay, any other sort of miscellaneous questions before we get into tonight's stuff? Yeah, Robin?
So as we're talking about these like basic prayers, I mean, my understanding before, and so from what we're talking about, is the main distinction is, are you praying by yourself or are you praying in a minyan? And in that, like, is there a space? Are there any distinctions where like having a rabbi there or not matters, or is it really just, are you in a group or are you by yourself? Like, are there, like, what's the rabbi's role other than just teacher and facilitator?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so my understanding is that the rabbi's role is indeed teacher and facilitator, um, but that prayers, there's no requirement of ordination to be a prayer leader. Um, One term for it that I'll put in the chat for the prayer leader is the shaliach tzibur, which means sort of like the community messenger. And so the person who's leading prayer, shaliach tzibur, or it gets abbreviated as SHATS, um, as the acronym for it. And so, yeah, there's no requirement of ordination to be the prayer leader. Um, the hope and the expectation and the sort of halacha is that the person who's leading prayers should be the learned person who knows what's going on. Um, all the better if they have a pleasant voice, that kind of thing. But there's no requirement for it, and there's no prayers that would be different with a rabbi present or not. Um, One thing in traditional liturgy is that um, in denominations of Judaism that maintain the distinction between the Kohanim, the priestly caste, and the rest of the Jewish people, that there is a priestly blessing that is for the Kohanim to say, for the people of the priestly caste, that they would say it, and that in their absence it would go unsaid, I believe. But that's a great question. Yeah, so it's a way in which the we see that at least within traditional Judaism, rabbis are not priests. Rabbis are not sort of intermediaries between a congregation and the divine, in the way that that a Catholic priest must be the is sort of the sanctioned officiant of the sacraments and that kind of thing. So yeah, so it really is a tradition that more so prioritizes lay learning and lay empowerment. I saw in the chat a question from Sarah. What exactly is the Aleinu? Yeah, that's a good question. So, and maybe if we have time tonight, we might dig into that one. But Aleinu is a prayer that is a concluding prayer. So I would consider it part of the cool down that follows the Amidah. And Aleinu leshabeach ladon hakol, it is upon us to give praise to the Master of all. And my understanding is that this prayer is originally it originates from the Rosh Hashanah Musaf liturgy. So that sort of mid morning on Rosh Hashanah, the Aleinu is said, and you all may know that during Aleinu, there's a line that says, "Va'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim," and we bend our knees and bow before and give thanks before the King of Kings, um, the Holy One, blessed be they. And in normal daily liturgy, when this prayer is said, we bend our knees, we bow, we straighten back up. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when this is said, we're permitted to fully prostrate upon the floor, upon the ground. The only time of year when rabbinic Jews engage in that, allegedly or normatively, I'll say. And my understanding is that that prayer, Aleinu, actually originated in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, and that the people, the masses, loved this prayer. They thought it was just like an excellent prayer. Like, the language is great, it really does it for them, and sort of clamored for its inclusion in more services, to the point that it's now just a part of every shacharit and I would say, I think it's all three prayer services, shacharit, mincha, and mariv, close with Aleinu. So that's a little bit about Aleinu. Um, One thing to note is that there are certain triumphalist tones and images in that prayer that, especially traditionally in its earliest forms, the prayer is praying for on that day God will be one and God's name will be one, and all the idolaters will realize the error of their ways and they're going to turn and worship God and that kind of stuff. Reconstructionist Judaism has altered a little bit of the language to modify, to reconstruct some of those triumphalist attitudes in favor of a more universalistic vision. And even in other liberal denominations and in some more traditional sectors as well, there's an ambivalence about the second paragraph that follows Aleinu, the paragraph that starts with Al Kain, therefore. And so there's often kind of, even in traditional communities, a pause between the part that's said and sung very exuberantly out loud, and then there's a pause so that the people who are going to daven the other part quietly can do that quietly, and then everyone comes back together with V'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, and that's the part about Bayom Hahu, on that day, God and God's name will be one. So that's a little bit about Aleinu. Any other questions? I'll take maybe one or maybe two more, and then we'll get into tonight's learning. Okay. Well, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or hang on to them for later, whatever you'd like to do. Okay, so here's a bit of what we have covered. We talked in our first week about the foundations of prayer and the blessing formula. Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, Adonai, who allowed us to get together and study prayer in this way. That's my blessing for tonight. We dealt with the service structure. That's our 3 services a day, Mariv in the evening, Shacharit in the morning, and Mincha in the afternoon. On week 3, we talked about the Shema and its blessings, particularly and dealt with the Baruch Hu. And then weeks 4 and 5, we spent on the Amidah. Week 4, we dealt with the Keva of the Amidah, the structure, the how-to, the basics. And last week, week 5, we dealt with more of the spiritual and existential questions surrounding prayer, dealing a bit with the Amidah, but more so opening a broader investigation into what prayer means for each of us. And so tonight we're in week 6. Based on some of the things that y'all have expressed to me over the course, I'm deciding that what we'll cover tonight in terms of content will be the Kaddish and the Kiddush, 2 important prayers that I think having some confidence, competence, and mastery with these prayers will go far when it comes to the kinds of Judaism that you all practice. Most services that you've been to, probably every service will feature the Kaddish, and certainly Friday night services feature a Kiddush. And knowing that, and Saturday morning services also have a Kiddush. Sometimes it looks a little different. But so in the interest of empowering us to actually practice as our communities practice, we'll focus on these things. And then if we have time, we can address some other things as well. Okay, so we'll start with the Kaddish. Raise your hand if you're familiar with Kaddish, or you've heard of the Kaddish, you know a thing or two about the Kaddish. Yeah, so a lot of people know something about it, and that makes sense. It's featured as part of every prayer service. So what is the Kaddish? So Kaddish, the word Kaddish means something like sanctification, which is one of these translations that only takes you so far, because in English, what does it really mean to sanctify? That's a sort of another question. But Kaddish comes from this Hebrew root. Hebrew language the words are built on these 3-letter roots. And so the 3-letter root is Kuf Dalet Shin. And with that word, you make all kinds of other words like Kedusha, holiness, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. And so this is Kaddish. It's another form of that. You may have heard of Hebrew described as Lashon Kodesh or Lashon Kodesh in Yiddish, the holy language. So Kadosh means holy. The root of it, to figure out what holiness or sanctity means, the meaning of this 3-letter root seems to have something to do with separation and being set apart. So that's in sort of the ancient proto-Jewish consciousness. When things are described as kadosh, that means there's something set apart about it. And in English or in Latin, sanctity, sanctus, also has a similar meaning, that something's being set apart. Maybe it's permitted, as in the word sanction, or maybe it's forbidden, as in the word sanction, which is one of my favorite kind of contronyms. And in Hebrew, it kind of functions the same way. There are some things that can be set apart for not so good reasons, but most of the times it means, holiness, exalted, something like that. And so what is the Kaddish in terms of its content? So the Kaddish is a prayer. It actually shows up several times throughout the service, not just the mourner's Kaddish. We'll address that in a moment. But what it means is it's a litany. It's a litany of praises for God. This means that it's basically a string of adjectives or participles or something, descriptors that um, we are praying that God's name be exalted, sanctified, magnified, glorified, and all these words that are basically synonymous with one another. We'll look at a translation of it in a moment, but that's what we're working with. It may be worth noting that the Kaddish is actually in Aramaic. It's not written in Hebrew, so it comes from a slightly later strata of Jewish history, um, Rabbinic Judaism, Mishnaic, Second Temple era, around then. So it's not from the Torah, it's from the era of the temple and then really the rabbis. Aramaic was, of course, the common tongue at that time. And so you may see words in it that seem similar to words that you know in Hebrew. For example, you may know the word olam to mean world or forever or universe. Well, in the Kaddish, it's alma, alma, and or you may know the Hebrew word for heaven or sky is shamayim. Well, in Aramaic, it's shemaya. Aramaic words have a lot of this endings, as you'll hear. So that's just something to keep in mind. It can be kind of a fun fact if you want to, tell someone that you know something that they don't know. I think it's one of the few Aramaic prayers that are really core liturgy. Most of the liturgy is in Hebrew. Kaddish is only said in the presence of a minyan. So this is why, especially for the mourner's Kaddish, when people are in mourning and they're observing an obligation to recite Kaddish for the first year following the death of a loved one, traditionally it's restricted to your parents' death, although nowadays, we certainly say Kaddish for all kinds of loved ones who have departed. But this is why people might be searching for a minyan to say Kaddish with. That this prayer is actually not said if you don't have a minyan. And a minyan is 10 adult Jews, and then in sort of pre-progressive Judaism, 10 adult male Jews, 10 adult men. So there are several forms of the Kaddish throughout the service, and the text slightly varies. We'll only really look at one of them tonight, and that's the mourner's Kaddish. But I'll lay out kind of for you what these various Kaddishes are. So there's the half Kaddish, the thing called the Chatzi Kaddish, the whole Kaddish, Kaddish Shalem, the rabbi's Kaddish, Kaddish de Rabbanan, and the mourner's Kaddish, Kaddish Yatom. Now, what are all these Kaddishes doing? Why are they in the service? Why are there so many? Well, they demarcate transitions or completion in the service. And we can think of this both structurally and spiritually, that they structurally demarcate a transition in the service, that in between, for example, Kabbalat Shabbat and Mariv, there would be a Chatzi Kaddish. If you've been to services with Techiyah, you know that we don't always do it, but sometimes when we do it, you may have heard Raz recite the Chatzi Kaddish, which helps to kind of break up the opening portion of the service of Kabbalat Shabbat, which is our warm-up, and then the Chatzi Kaddish comes, and then it's time for the Baruch Hu. So it brings us into Mariv. So the Chatzi Kaddish, right, serves to demarcate the transition within the service. Kaddish Shalem, the whole Kaddish, comes when you finish the service. We usually don't include Kaddish Shalem. One thing about Reconstructionism uh, is that Mordecai Kaplan believed against meaningless repetition, is my understanding of it. And I think various communities have taken license with that belief and thought, well, if we're doing a Chatzi Kaddish earlier and we're doing a Mourner's Kaddish at the end, we don't need another little uh, Kaddish Shalem right before the Mourner's Kaddish or something like that. So you may not be so familiar with that one. There's the Rabbi's Kaddish, Kaddish de Rabbanan. This Kaddish is said in the completion of learning. So if you finish studying a text, you can say Kaddish de Rabbanan. If you finish a course of study, you can say Kaddish de Rabbanan. So we see that it marks completion and sort of separation. The mourner's Kaddish as well, we can see sort of spiritually, we can interpret it a bit to think of, why do we say this Kaddish to mark someone's death? And it's because they've completed their days. It's sort of a sort of optimistic view. And I know that interpretation for many losses may not feel right, but that's an interpretation that I've heard. Okay, so let's we're gonna go into the Kaddish. We're gonna go into the words of it in English and in Aramaic, and we're gonna start with some English. So just so you can get a sense of what we're dealing with here. And this, I will say, this is a translation from Kol HaNeshama, the Reconstructionist prayer book. And this translation is striving to be a bit more readable, a bit more poetic than just a plain word for word translation. But you do get a sense of it, of what it contains, especially in the second paragraph. So could I get a reader to read this whole Kaddish? For reference, this is the mourner's Kaddish here.
I can if you like.
Yeah, thanks, Lee.
Let God's name be made great and holy in the world that was created as God willed. May God complete the holy realm in your own lifetime, in your days, and in the days of all of the house of Israel. Is that quickly and soon? Is that a typo? I'm sorry.
That is a typo. It should not say
Okay, sorry.
stand soon. Yep.
Quickly and soon. And say Amen. May God's great name be blessed forever and as long as worlds endure. May it be blessed and praised and glorified and held in honor, viewed with awe, embellished and revered, and may the blessed name of holiness be hailed, though it be higher than all the blessings, songs, praises, and consolations that we utter in this world. And say Amen. May heaven grant a universal peace and life for us and for all Israel. And say Amen. May the one who creates harmony above make peace for us and for all Israel and for all who dwell on earth. And say Amen.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah. Any first thoughts about the meaning of this, or is it raising anything up for you, or any questions or anything so far? I have to say that of all of Jewish prayer, this is perhaps some of the most opaque stuff because uh, if depending on how you think of God, and what does God need, and what are we supposed to do in relation to God, um, this prayer can be very opaque because it's all about let's make God's name great and complete and magnified and blessed and revered and embellished. Yeah, anyone have Any thoughts or questions about this meaning so far? Yeah, Robin.
I mean, you already spoke to this a bit, but I know in my relationship with this prayer, the part that I have grappled with the most is how it relates to mourning and how it, it's not at all about our loved ones who've passed. And so what it is to ascribe meaning to that through that ritual and with these words.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be confusing and uh, even frustrating, vexing, challenging for folks because the experience of saying Kaddish for a loved one, is obviously can be so tender, can also be quite fraught. Um, but to be directed to say words that have nothing to do with the loss is complicated and it invites complication. Um, yeah, for me, part of how I think of that partially is sort of that they're filler, in some ways, it's filler words. I think of upon hearing that someone has died, upon hearing news that someone has died, the traditional Jewish response is Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Blessed be the judge of truth. And, we could explore what that might mean theologically. It's probably something complicated. Maybe we don't agree with it or not. Um, but most of all, I think of it as like it's words for a time when there are no words. Baruch Dayan Emet, because it's like someone tells you someone died. What do you say? And so for Kaddish as well, I think there's something about this 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 routinization, this routine of saying these are the words that are here to say. Um, and I think of it not as a distraction from the grief, but sort of a container. And I saw Shell, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think you're giving too much emphasis to the actual translation, and maybe this is personal. I mean, it comes out to very much Mersey dotes and dozy dotes and little lambsy ivy. And I don't mean to minimize it, but it's just a ritual that you do when you are mourning. And it symbolizes your mourning and maybe emphasizes your mourning and your grief. But in terms of word for word translation, I mean, and I've said this before, I mean, you wake most of us up in the middle of the night and say, Yiskadav, Yiskadav, Shemei Rabbah, and we'll say Amen, just because it's automatic. And the fact that it is Aramaic makes it even more dense, more remote, more, I forget the word you used. It, and because most of us, I don't think, would utter words like these in a normal course of mourning or anything else. Maybe I'm making this too individual, but I just don't think most of us would say, may be blessed, praised, glorified, held in honor, viewed with awe, embellished and revered, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that occurs to most of us 20th or 21st century folks. But the ritual still does, like much prayer. That's my 2 cents. You're welcome to reject it or accept it.
I accept it. I think that's right on. I think you're right. And I think, yeah, we'll look at it. This is a great segue to start to look at it in the original, in the Aramaic, and to work through it. Um, it is true that, you know, perhaps we put on to read prayer and seek to understand the words and to translate it and things like that, and to wrap our head around the concepts and these kinds of things it's a rather modernist way of approaching prayer. It's a rather modernist way of approaching what we're doing. We're trying, these words are significant and they reflect concepts which reflect philosophies, and we'll have to try to understand the philosophy and put ourselves in those shoes. I think you're onto something that um, there is something sort of invocatory about it, um, especially with the sound and the rhythm of it. And so, what we'll do now is um, we'll work through the Kaddish, and we can kind of parse it a bit. And because, yeah, I think you're right that for folks who are familiar with Kaddish, it does become sort of automatic, or you can kind of muster it up right away once you get to that point. Yeah. Um, and there is something really interesting and powerful, I think, about the rhythm, the pacing of it, and the sounds. So, um, I guess what we'll do now is I'll just read to start us off. I'll just read through the Kaddish. I'll recite the Kaddish. Um, Now you'll notice that there are a couple of things that are highlighted. So one thing that I forgot to mention was that there is a call and response aspect to the Kaddish. And so what I've highlighted are in yellow are when the congregation would say Amen, and in blue, times when both the reader and the congregants would say these lines together. So, for the mourners Kaddish, that the people who are in mourning would say the opening part, Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, and everyone who's listening would say Amen. Whereas to our first little chunk in blue, Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mevorach Le'olam Ulalmei Almaya, that would be said by the reader and the rest of the community together. And some of these are a little loose, where it's some people's custom that they're reading and they'll say V'imru Amen, and then the congregation will say Amen. But for others, they'll just say V'imru, and they'll wait for the other people to say Amen. So it kind of varies. I would say in practice, people aren't, at least in our communities, aren't strict about the sort of halachic ways of whether you should say your own amens or not. But I'll just demonstrate reading the Kaddish, and if you'd like, yeah, why don't folks unmute and you can chime in with the group responsive parts, so the yellow and the blue parts. And if you don't wish to, you don't have to. And it will sound there may be a little bit of audio cacophony from Zoom, but that happens. Okay, so I'll start us off. Oh, and one more thing is that the transliteration that I've reflected here says Yit Gadal, which follows the Sephardi pronunciation that has become normative in modern Hebrew. So you may or may not know that Ashkenazi, which is pretty much Central and Eastern European Jewish ethnicities, would see this letter, the second letter over here, and that's called a saf for Ashkenazim. Saf makes a s sound. And for Sephardim, it's a taf. It makes a t sound. So for a variety of interesting reasons, the Sephardic pronunciation has become authoritative in modern Hebrew. But so you may hear people say Yiskadal, like shell, or you may hear people say Yitgadal. They're both correct, and whichever you want to say is totally fine, regardless of your, kind of Jewish ethnicity or lack thereof. Okay, so I'll start us off. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Amen.
Bialma divrach hirute v'yamlich malchute. B'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala ubizman kariv v'imru.
Amen.
Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mevorach le'olam u'lalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekudesha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen.
Amen.
Okay, so that's our Kaddish. So we can see, you could hear some of the sonic aspects that I was sort of alluding to, that there's this rhythm, Yitgadal v'Yitkadash, especially in the second paragraph. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha brichu. It sort of carries with it that rhythm of shuckling, of the sort of davening where you're bending forward and backwards and trembling a little bit like that, sort of quaking with the rhythm of it. And yeah, I think there's rhyme. We hear yitbarach v'yishtabach. We hear similar sound clusters, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal. So there's a certain poetry to it. Just to point out, we have this shemei de kudsha. Kudsha is our Aramaic form related to kadosh. So we would say, maybe we might say Hakadosh Baruch Hu in Hebrew, the Holy One, blessed be He. And here we say Shemei Kudsha Brichu. So yeah, this is our Kaddish. So I'm wondering, does someone want to try reading it for us? And we can be your kahal. Or first off, any questions about, um, you know, the call and response aspects, the rhythm, anything else? Any questions so far?
Could you just read it slowly one more
Yeah,
time?
for
You
sure.
read it kind of quickly. Is that
Yeah,
okay? And then other people can maybe have a chance because, okay, thank you.
yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll take it line by line, and I will. Here's what I think. Maybe I'll do a slower reading all the way through, and then we can take it line by line and do kind of call and response of just practicing each line. Which, for some of us, this is, some of us might know it like the back of our hand already, and some of us might know it not at all. Um, so it's a good way to work through it. So I'll read it once more, slower. Yit gadal v'yit kadash shemei rabba
Amen.
v'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uvyomechon ובחיי תכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו
Amen.
אמן. יהא שמי רבה מברך
Lam.
לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהא שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ועל כל יושבי תבל, ואמרו אמן. Okay. Any questions before we take it line by line? Yeah, Bobby.
It's not a question, it's a comment. So I don't think there's any way for me to memorize this unless I memorize one line or just say it over and over and over again. I mean, I don't even be able to memorize it, just to be able to pronounce it all the way through and to just keep doing it, but line for line to break it down. Because it really bugs me when people in congregation could just rattle the thing off, and I'm like, I'm lost here, or how do I keep up? But yeah, that's
Yeah,
what I think.
absolutely. Yeah, I think it really is like time and repetition that lead to that sense of familiarity. It's also the case as well that one place to start might be to train yourself on the coming in, listening for the Shemei Rabbah, coming in for the Amen, coming in for V'imru Amen. With the exception of the first Amen and the Brichu that comes later, there's a V'imru that clues you in, which literally means and say. So it's the leader of the prayer saying, praying all these things. Okay, and say Amen. Okay, good. You said Amen. I'm gonna keep going. Yeah, and it can be really hard. I see that, Sarah, in the chat that the the difficulties around Kaddish are it's not an easy prayer. I mean, it's a big chunk of Aramaic, and and it's a lot of consonant clusters that aren't really said in English. It's very foreign. It's very different. And yeah, so um, I think you're not alone, Sarah, in feeling that difficulty of um, of of struggling with Kaddish for one reason or another in a time of grief that makes it all the more poignant and challenging. Any other questions before? I think we'll go through it line by line and give everyone a chance to sort of repeat after me. Okay, so let's do that. Um, Here we go. So um, if you it's probably best if you remain muted for this. That way folks can do it at their own pace, but I'll take it slow and give space, and I'll invite you all to repeat after me to practice saying these words. I also want to encourage people, if you can't read Hebrew, which is many of us, feel free to read the transliteration. Um, I am blessed to be in community with lots of people who have lived really robust Jewish lives and can't really read Hebrew. That happens, and that's fine. Um, so there's no shame in it. And more on Hebrew learning later. I'll send out some resources. But okay, so we'll take it line by line. So repeat after me. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. Be'alma divra chirute. Ve'yamlich malchute. And let's put those two together. Yit gadal ve'yit kadash Shemei Rabbah. Be'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute. We'll move on. Bechayechon uvyomechon. That can be a complicated little cluster. Bechayechon uvyomechon. Uvchaye dechol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala ubizman kariv. Ve'imru amen. Okay, we'll do the whole first paragraph. We'll try it. Try reciting along with me if you can with the whole first paragraph. Yit gadal ve'yit kadash shemei rabbah. Be'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute. Bechayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala ubizman kariv ve'imru amen. Our next line in blue. Yehe shmei rabba mevorach le'olam ulalmei almaya. We'll do that again. Yehe shmei rabba mevorach le'olam ulalmei almaya. Okay, we'll keep going. Yitbarach v'yishtabach. Ve'yit pa'ar ve'yit romam ve'yit naseh. And we'll do that whole line. Yit barach ve'yishtabach. Ve'yit pa'ar ve'yit romam ve'yit naseh. Ve'yit hadar ve'yit haleh ve'yit halel. Shmei de Kiddush brichu. We'll do that again. Ve'yit hadar ve'yit haleh ve'yit halel. Shmei de Kiddush brichu. We'll take this little paragraph from the beginning of it at Yit Barach, and then we'll keep going. Yit Barach ve'yishtabach. Yeah, I'll invite you to say this along with me. Yit Barach ve'yishtabach ve'yit pa'ar ve'yit romam ve'yit naseh. Ve'yit hadar ve'yit haleh ve'yit halal. Shmei de Kiddush brichu. We continue over here. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. So it's le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Let's try it from le'ela. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. ta'amiran bi'alma ve'imru amen. Then we're down here. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ve'imru amen. We'll do this bit again here. So it's Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Ve'imru amen. This last part might be familiar to you from other services as or the closing of the Amidah. Ose shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, ve'imru amen. So why don't you, how about you all read with me? We'll read it all the way through, and then I'll take a brave volunteer or two before we turn to study some of the Kiddush. Okay, so we'll start at Yit Gadal. Yit Gadal ve'yit kadash shemei Rabbah. Amen. Bi'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute. B'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala ubizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehe shmei rabba mevorach le'olam ulalmei almaya. Yit barach ve'yishtabach ve'yit pa'ar ve'yit romam ve'yit naseh. Ve'yit hadar ve'yit haleh ve'yit halal. Shemei de kudesha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran bi'alma bi'imru amen. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya. Ve'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Ose shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, ve'imru amen. All right. Now, does anyone who for whom Kaddish is not a back of the hand kind of thing, does anyone who's newer to saying the Kaddish, or even intermediate at saying the Kaddish, want to give it a whirl? And if not, it's all good. You'll have this recording, and I hope that you'll practice it both in community and on your own. Because though the Kaddish can't be recited on your own, you can still practice it on your own. You can still get familiar with it on your own. Anyone want to give it a whirl? Okay. Well, this was our little bit of a Kaddish study. And so we'll move now into Kiddush, from Kaddish to Kiddush. Very similar in name, and for good reason. So in our remaining time, we'll explore the Kiddush. So what is Kiddush? Raise your hand if you've heard of Kiddush. Yes, everyone here seems to have heard of Kiddush. Maybe they've sponsored a Kiddush or brought Kiddush or made Kiddush or something. Yes, Kiddush, of course, is it. We'll take it from the basics. So unlike Kaddish, Kiddush is kind of sort of the Ashkenazi or the Americanized pronunciation of it. Sephardic Hebrew might say Kiddush. So if you're speaking to an Israeli, they would say Kiddush. But unlike the Kaddish, Kiddush is Hebrew. It comes from that same root as Kaddish, so it means something like sanctification. Now, um, Kiddush is the special blessing recited over wine or grape juice for Shabbat and festivals, and it's usually said before a meal. So you wouldn't, it's, we talked about this a little bit on our first class dealing with brachas, with blessings, but you wouldn't be making Kiddush on just a glass of wine that you're having, with breakfast, um, you know, as one does. Um, Unless it was a holiday, in which case you would have to make Kiddush on that. But so if you're just drinking wine on an everyday occasion, it's not necessarily making Kiddush. Kiddush is a special additional blessing that goes along with the normal blessing for wine, as we'll see in a moment. Kiddush is a way of sanctifying time. This prayer is how we sanctify time. It's sort of, time is, of course, a rather immaterial concept. And so we need something concrete and tactile that we're able to connect to for our blessing. So our tradition calls for wine or grape juice. In the Torah, one of the 10 Commandments, you may be familiar with it, says, remember the Sabbath day and sanctify it. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekidashto, which is up in the top right corner there. And so that's our word there, kidashto, make it kadosh, kiddush it. And so Jewish law, you may be interested in knowing that Jewish law says that you can actually substitute, if you don't have wine or grape juice is considered fine for as a substitute for wine. But if you don't have grape juice, you can use something known as chamar medina. I love this fun fact about Kiddush, that there's some thing about you can make Kiddush on like a beer or some kind of liquor. And there's various attitudes about, oh, can we do it on lemonade? This place is very interested in this kind of drink. Can we do it with this drink? You can consult your local rabbis for that. But yeah, the rabbinic tradition holds that you can make it on the national drink. So do with that what you will. Or on Friday nights, you can make it on challah. Apparently, you can't do that on Saturday morning for Saturday morning Kiddush for some reason that is explained in various texts. But so there's always a way, and of course, in our progressive, non-dogmatic approach to Judaism, we give lots of latitude for people to make Kiddush on varieties of things as needed. But the text of the Kiddush is there's a part of it is a collection of biblical verses involving creation and the Exodus. So we're connecting these two things that make sense when you think about it. Not only are these pivotal moments in human history and Jewish history, but they are also two of the moments from which Shabbat comes. So why do we do Shabbat? Well, in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, you'll see that God rests on the seventh day after creating the world in 6 days. And in the book of Shemot, in Exodus, you'll see that God gives the Israelites the Sabbath as a permanent reminder for the redemption, the liberation from Egypt. So these things are, both of these sides of it, of Shabbat, are put next to each other in the Kiddush prayers. Okay, so there's kind of 3 parts to the Friday evening Kiddush. Like I said, Kiddush it looks different on festivals, um, and it looks different on Saturday mornings as well. But we'll focus on the Friday evening Kiddush. This is probably the one that you'll encounter most of the time. And once you get this one, you can probably work your way around the others. So there's a three-part structure here. We have an introductory paragraph, which consists of the recitation of biblical verses from Genesis, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Then there's a simple blessing on wine. You may remember this one from our first class. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. And then there's this elongated paragraph. And that paragraph is really, that's the part of it that's kind of the Kiddush blessing. It ends with Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh hashabbat. Blessed are you, Adonai, who makes Shabbat holy. So if the whole thing is about proclaiming the holiness of Shabbat, it makes sense that we need kind of a separate blessing portion there. So let's get into it. Okay. So I think it's helpful to have the English in our mind before we start working with the Hebrew. So could someone read on the bottom left the English translation here where it says, and there was morning and there was evening?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, thanks, Raz.
And there was morning and there was evening, the sixth day. And the heavens and the earth and all that filled them were complete. And on the seventh day, God completed the labor he had performed. And he refrained on the seventh day from all the labor which he had performed. And God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it. For he then refrained from all his labor from the act of creation that God had performed.
Yeah, thank you, Raz. And there's that little parenthetical underneath that says, permit me, distinguished ones, teachers, my friends. We'll talk about that in a moment. And just a note, so we're using the masculine pronoun here. This is the traditional formula for Friday Night Kiddush. Those of us who may have done some. Those of us who know God know that God is not exclusively a he, or if a he at all. But this is the traditional framework. Traditional Hebrew is gendered in such a way that I didn't want to just erase the gendered quality of the language, but I encourage y'all to, do what you need to do to make it meaningful, relevant, and resonant for you all. But this is, so as I just mentioned, this is a quote from the Torah. This is from Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now, there is that little bit in the parentheses at the bottom, which is sort of our bridge between this biblical verse and the blessing itself. And in Hebrew, the first word, this permit me, is savri. And you may have heard when people are reciting Kiddush, if they do this introductory paragraph, that they say something like savri chavarai or savri miranan. And some people go lechayim. And that's kind of your bridge between the opening biblical verses and the blessing of Kiddush.
Wow.
Now, what I'll do now is I'll just sing this according to the melody that I know it. And we'll practice it a little bit, but we'll more so focus on the paragraph that follows after this. Okay. So we'll start, you can find the transliteration on the bottom right, the translation on the left, or the Hebrew at the top. Vayihi erev, vayihi voker, yom hashishi. Vayichulu hashamayim v'haaretz, v'chol tzivam. V'yechol Elohim b'yom hashvi'i, melachto asher asa. Vayishpot b'yom hashvi'i, mikol melachto asher asa. Vayivarech Elohim et Yom HaShevi'i, Vayikadesh oto, Ki bo shavat mikol melachto, Asher bara Elohim lasot. Savri Miranan v'Rabanan v'Ravosai. And everyone goes, L'chaim. And then I would go to the next part, our Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri hagafen. Now, before we go on there, any questions about this so far? We won't work through it line by line like we did with Kaddish, but I do encourage you to spend some time getting to know this introductory paragraph, and especially if you're musical, to get the tune. I actually don't know the origins of that tune. I don't know if it's particular to certain communities or what. It's not the Torah trope, and so that's something worth noting. That whereas when we learned Ve'ahavta, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, all that is the Torah cantillation. This is though it's Torah text, we're dealing with just a melody that it was put to. And so you may hear other melodies that people sing that to. But any questions on kind of our intro paragraph before we move on? Okay. So again, I would say my Savri Miranan v'Rabanan v'Rabotai, and people say L'chaim, which means, of course, to life. And then our blessing on the wine or grape juice, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Typo there, that should say borei. Sorry about that. And then we have, boom, all this to say. Now, let me sing through it to jog your memory, then we'll read the English, then we'll work through however we want to work through it. This is the traditional version. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu, v'shabat kodsho b'yava uvratzon hinichil lanu, zikaron lema'aseh v'reishit. Ki hu yom techila lemekraye kodesh, zecher letziat Mitzrayim. Ki vanu vacharta, v'yotanu kidashta, mikol ha'amim, v'shabat kodshecha, b'yahava uvratzon, hinchaltanu. Baruch atah Adonai, mikadesh hashabat. That might ring a bell to folks. That's a traditional Ashkenazi melody. I think it's an Ashkenazi melody. And here's our Friday night Kiddush. Like I said, traditional version. We'll see some changes in a moment. But first, I want to have us read the English of the text here. Could someone read this English for us?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy.
Hi. Blessed are you, Adonai, ruler of the universe, who sanctified us with his commandments and hoped for us, and with love and intent invested in us with his sacred Sabbath, as a memorial to the deed of creation. It is the first among the holy festivals commemorating the exodus from Egypt. For you chose us and sanctified us out of all nations, and with love and intent you invested us with your holy Sabbath. Blessed are you, Adonai, who sanctifies the Sabbath.
Thank you. Yeah, so we see there's a lot going on here. It's kind of a long paragraph. The English is always longer to translate it into English than the Hebrew, so it seems like a lot. But we see in these sentences the connection of Shabbat is a memorial of the day, the deed of creation, Zikaron leMaaseh Bereshit, a memorial for the works of creation, and it's Zecher Letziat Mitzrayim, that God gave us Shabbat to remember the going out, the exodus from Egypt. Now you may see, perhaps because I've put it in bold, that there is a line here that says, "For you chose us and sanctified us out of all nations. Kivanu v'acharta v'otanu kidashta mikol ha'amim." For you chose us and sanctified us from all the nations. That's what it means. There's no interpretive leaps and bounds being made there. Now, Reconstructionist Jews do not say this line. We have a substitute line because Reconstructionism famously rejects the concept of Jews as chosen people who are chosen at the expense of other nations. So if there's a Reconstructionist idea of chosenness, it has it's not one of ethnocentrism. It's not one that has to involve putting down other nations. And so I believe it was Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, who innovated this line, which says, Ki eleinu karata v'otanu kidashta le'avodatecha. So, for you have called us and sanctified us to your service. So rather than being chosen from among all the other nations, it just becomes about us and God instead of being about us and them. Some other denominations, I think the Reform movement and other folks, with the original traditional blessing, they just do a simpler change where they say, Kivanu v'acharta, for you chose us and sanctified us, ve'otanu kidashta, im kol ha'amim, which means with all of the nations, instead of from all of the nations, out of. So that's another switch. But this is kind of I actually really appreciate the Reconstructionist version, which takes some liberties and some innovations. And this same phrase is also used in the Torah blessing, which is content that we would maybe perhaps have to cover in part 2 or something, that says, Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, that you have chosen us from all of the nations. Reconstructionist liturgy says, Asher kervanu le'avodato, you bring us close to your service. Okay, so that's our Kiddush. So any questions about Kiddush so far? Yeah, Ross?
Going back to the first paragraph, I was just looking this up because I was curious. I can't remember whether you mentioned this or if this is accurate. So I just looked this up online. I Googled it. It's from encyclopedia.com or whatever. It says the text of the current Sabbath Kiddush consists of an introductory paragraph from Genesis chapter 1, line 31, and chapter 2, lines 1 through 3. Is that possible? Is that likely?
Yeah, I think it depends on, do you see how in the Hebrew here I put this in brackets, the Vayhi
Right.
Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom HaShishi. So
Right.
that might be Genesis 1:31,
Right.
because
That's
it,
what I'm thinking. Yeah.
yeah, because it ends with, there was evening and morning, a sixth day.
Right.
Now,
Right.
some people, my experience has been that this practice varies. Some people omit this phrase entirely and just start with Vayechulu. And some people, I've heard people just say Yom HaShishi, which is kind of confusing, which means the sixth day.
Mhm.
So they say Yom HaShishi and then they say Vayechulu. um, and the heavens and the earth and all that filled them, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think the practice varies a bit, but that's kind of the idea, is that they're bridging the end of the sixth day with the beginning of the seventh.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions about Kiddush, about saying it? Should I sing through it again? We can practice the words a bit or something.
Would you sing through it again, Jake? That was very helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So we'll go through the whole three-parter, and I think I even put it right here. Okay, so here it is all together, the Friday evening Kiddush. And we'll start at Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Voker. So there was evening and morning. And I'll say, keep your ear open for words that you recognize in the Hebrew, because I think that can be a real gateway when you have a little something to latch onto. So some things might be, you might recognize Shvi'i. Shvi'i means the seventh. Yom HaShvi'i is the seventh day. You might hear a lot of Shavat. You know about Shavat is just a form of the word Shabbat. And yeah, things like Zikaron and Zecher, which is all about memory, to remember. But keep your ear open, see if there's other things that you might recognize as well. Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Voker, Yom HaShishi. ויחולו השמיים והארץ וכל צבאם ויכל אלוהים יום השביעי מלאכתו אשר עשה וישפוט ביום השביעי מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי ויקדש אותו כי בו שבת מכל מלאכתו אשר ברא אלוהים לעשות. סברי מרנן ורבנן ורבותיי. לחיים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן. If I was drinking, I wouldn't drink yet. Wait till the end. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו ורצוונו. ושבת קודשו באהבה וברצון הנחיל לנו, זיכרון למעשה וראשית. כי הוא יום תחילה למקראי קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים. כי אלינו קראת, ואותנו קידשת לעבודתך. ושבת קודשך באהבה וברצון הנחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת. And then we can drink. But of course, if we're just saying a Wednesday night glass of wine, we would only say Borei Pri Hagafen, not the full thing. Okay, so any questions on Kiddush? Or should we just open it up for some general miscellaneous questions? Alrighty, well, I'll encourage folks to, listen to the recording if you want to use this recording or others, and to practice that Kiddush. Like I said, this will probably be, whether you take up a morning daily prayer practice or not, you're probably going to be in a setting where Friday night Kiddush is said. And it's good to know what's going on. It's good to be able to participate. And I will also say on that when it comes to saying Kiddush, if you say Amen on someone else's Kiddush, that counts as if you're saying Kiddush. So if you're concerned about fulfilling your ritual obligations, you actually don't need to be the one to say it. You can just be present, but all the better to be present and know what you're saying Amen to. Okay, well that I think concludes our Kaddish and Kiddush business for tonight. Maybe we'll just close right there and I'll stick around for some questions. Um, well, let me take maybe 5 minutes or so of questions on the record, because when one person has a question, it usually means other people do. And I know we actually do have some folks who are basically participating asynchronously. So they're watching the videos after the fact. So we'll take some questions for all of our benefit and for their benefit, and then we'll close out. So who's got questions? What do we got?
So no motzi?
What's that?
So no motzi?
Motzi, you'll go back to lesson 1 and you'll see we did motzi is the thing about motzi is that it's the blessing itself is simple in that it's just Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and that is just the bread blessing. So that one doesn't get a special that doesn't get its own special extension blessing, special thing about Shabbat. That's just our normal bread blessing.
Okay.
And the thing with blessing the bread is that when it comes to food blessings, there is an order that you're supposed to. There are kind of 5 categories of foods to bless. So we have bread, different kinds of grains, fruit of the tree, fruit of the ground, and miscellaneous. And wine gets its own thing. Wine and grape juice gets its own thing. But so the thing about motzi is that if you're eating bread as part of your meal, you say motzi, and you don't have to say any other blessings on the food, because it sort of constitutes a whole meal. And then traditionally you're obligated to do the grace after meals then as well. But so the Shabbos motzi is kind of, I think it's interesting because it's sort of like, yeah, we could just be eating. Now, of course, there's another kind of significance of the challahs and that kind of stuff. That there's 2 challahs to symbolize the double portion of manna that the Israelites got in when they were wandering in the wilderness. But yeah, the specific Shabbos blessing falls on the wine and grape juice. But if you're making Kiddush, if you have no wine and grape juice and you're making Kiddush on the with the challah, you would substitute the relevant blessing for that Borei Pri Hagafen bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it now.
Yep. Yeah. So that food part becomes the that's where you can substitute it. So the wine and grape juice is kind of just the placeholder for the holiness of time that we're trying to bless.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, other questions? Other questions for on the record?
Well, I had one that popped into my head, but we don't want to get into it now. But when we're talking about mourner's Kaddish, I thought about Shiva, sitting Shiva,
Yeah.
but that could be a whole at least half a session in itself. But when we're talking about because my first Shiva, like that when they had a minyan and the son rent his garment and all the mirrors were covered and all that stuff. But yeah, it's quite the ritual and it has a lot of meaning, but I don't think we want to get into it now.
Yeah, there's a lot as you're saying, a lot of morning rituals, a lot
Mhm.
in the sort of field of morning rituals. Perhaps relevant to tonight, some things to mention quickly would be that the Kaddish, a couple of things. So there's sort of three primary levels of three or four primary levels of mourning. So there's kind of the immediate like death, and then there's the first week is the first week of mourning, Shiva, meaning seven, Sheva, we Yom HaShvi'i, the seventh day. Um, so the first week of mourning, and then there's Shloshim, 30 days, the first 30 days of mourning, and then there's the first year of mourning being significant. Um, and yeah, certainly a lot of people are scrupulous to try to ensure a minyan for each day of Shiva or each day that they're hosting people for Shiva. Um, but that the practice of trying to say Kaddish every day for a year, um, which is the prescription, um, uh, must be, that must resonate in a whole other level, to be doing that for every day, and then to be doing it, and then to be freed of that obligation, or to be, the time sort of to have that time elapse, um, must be incredibly powerful. Yeah. Yeah, Russ.
Regarding the year of Kaddish, I'm somehow remembering that it's 11 months as opposed to a year. And I'm wondering, I've never understood the reason for that. And as I'm sitting here thinking about it, maybe it's because the last month before the year is up should be kind of free so that you approach the yard site with some kind of renewed memory, renewed strength, renewed something. Um, I does that make sense, or do you know the reason? Other reasons for the
I
11?
don't I don't know the reasons, but I also know that 11 months being the timeline as well. It's not really a year.
Yeah,
Um, and that and I don't know why. Um, but I think there's some variance in that. I think there's variation in that custom. I do know that part of um, part of the Kaddish is thought to be that saying Kaddish for a deceased person is thought to give their soul an aliyah, to give some kind of upliftment to their soul. Um, and so there's kind of attitudes that, in saying the Kaddish, you're some people might see it as like currying favor from divine judgment, and some people might see it that you're somehow uh, in other ways uplifting their soul, or you know um, it depends on your views of what happens after we die and all that kinds of stuff. um, but there are definitely traditional sources that speak to that. Yeah, so that it's not a lot of times, especially in the contemporary world, um, people think about the experience of Kaddish for the person who is grieving, to be surrounded by community for this certain time, to have this structure for grief and that kind of thing. But traditional sources also speak about the effect that Kaddish has on the soul of the person who has died.
I just looked it up and I found something very funny, which I never in a million years thought of. The custom is to recite Kaddish for 11 months only. Saying Kaddish the entire 12 months would give the impression that the deceased was a very wicked person who needs protection the entire 12 months. You're muted.
Okay, wow. Wow.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So we have all kinds of people in our,
The person was not wicked at all. The person was, yeah, a really
yeah.
good person. Okay.
Yeah, I think in our community, I don't think that saying Kaddish for the 11th to 12th month would give any foul impression. But
Of
I guess it
course,
depends on where you are and who you're with and how they interpret things.
right. And this could simply be a midrash or an interpretation.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely a matter of custom, it sounds like. Yeah, Bobby?
Yeah.
I thought perhaps it had something to do with if you follow the tradition doing the stone setting. But I know that also not everybody does it exactly at the 12th month. Some do it earlier, some do it later. But that's just something that popped in my head when Ross was asking that. So I don't know that they're related at all, really.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Definitely, definitely something to explore, and definitely something that there's a whole body of knowledge and sources on.
Yeah, stone
So,
setting is typically um, arranged around the condition of the earth,
mm,
not in the winter months. Um, has to be before the ground gets very hard.
fair, yeah, yeah, and I think that's probably also where that related to that is sort of probably the development of the unveiling, the tradition of that. If the stone is already in the ground, that then there's a ceremonial unveiling of it.
Mhm.
Um, close to the year, somewhere around the year following the yard site.
Mhm.
Um, well, I think we'll we'll shut down for now. I do want to say a couple things. So, first of all, this was awesome. Yasher koach to all of you for all of this learning. Um,
Yasher koach to you, Jake. Thank
Baruch
thank
Tiyeh.
you. This was phenomenal, really.
Absolutely phenomenal.
Yes.
My pleasure. I think it's really important to, work with the foundational stuff and,
Mhm.
you know, let's start where we are and everything. Um, and I do think that there's definitely demand for more, an interest, I should say, for perhaps it is demand,
It is.
um, for part two and beyond.
Yeah.
And I definitely take that seriously. So there's no concrete plans for what's next, but stay tuned. I can think of a number of areas that folks might be interested in, and maybe I'll even send out a survey to figure out kind of what to prioritize. But I will also say that um, Tehillah and our kindred communities of Synagogues Rising are working to put together some Hebrew language programming, Hebrew language learning programming for folks who want to learn Hebrew with, like-minded justice pursuing people. And so uh, I think you've received there was a notice about this in the Tehillah Times, but I will put it in the chat as well. A survey to express interest in this Hebrew language learning. And then I'll also say that I think it's in February and March, Sfara, the traditionally radical yeshiva, is offering an Aleph Bet Basics class, 5 weeks Aleph Bet Basics. Um, and so if anyone needs to learn the Hebrew alphabet, or perhaps you've spent some time learning the Hebrew alphabet and would like to brush up, that would be a great opportunity. Um, we know that prayer is much more than just reading things in Hebrew, but it does definitely contribute to our confidence and empowerment and all that kinds of stuff. Um, and let's see, what else? I think, yeah, let's see. Okay, well, I guess I will lead us in. What else do I want to say is that we have Tehillah has weekly Torah study. If you ever want to drop in, you do have to register, but please do register and I will approve you um, at www.tehillah.org/lunchtime learning. We're doing weekly Torah study of the Torah portion. So there's lots of opportunities for learning, lots of cool stuff. And I hope that I will see y'all at services sometime soon. And I guess I'll close us out with, we could say, the Kaddish de Rabbanan, which you know some of. You'll get to see some of the additions and stuff in the Kaddish de Rabbanan, because we have finished our course of study. And I'm pulling up the a wonderful and interesting transliteration of it from Chabad.org, so we can see how this will go. And I also just wanted to say that I'll be sending out some resources for further study of prayer and other things, including a beloved video series, not this one, but a different video series from Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who spends something like 12 hours talking about various aspects of prayer. So especially if you're interested in the spiritual stuff, that will be good for that. Okay, so I'll invite you to unmute and feel free to say your amen, or as they say here, Amen. 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 Yeah. So feel free to please unmute and say your amens and your Yehesh Rabbah part together, and lead us in the Kaddish de Rabbanan. And I'm hoping that there's not too much that I'm not familiar with here. Okay. Yitzkadal v'yitzkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Ve'olma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei ve'yatzmach pur kamnei v'ikarev mishechei
Amen.
v'chayechon uvyamechon uv'chayei dechol beis Yisrael ba'agala v'zman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam olamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtab. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam olamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yishadar v'yisale v'yisalal shmei dekudesha brichu.
Amen.
Ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush bechata v'nechemata da'amiran bi'alma v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Al Yisrael ve'al Rabbanan ve'al Talmidehem ve'al Talmidei ve'kol ve'talmidehon ve'al kol man da'askin ba'oraita di ve'atra hedin v'di bechol achat atar ve'atar yehe lechon ulechon shlama rabba china v'chizda v'rachamin v'chayin arichin umzona revicha ufurkana min kadam avuhon devishmaya v'imru Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim tovim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru
Amen.
Amen. Oseh shalom bimramav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru Amen.
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 Amen. Yasher koach, everyone.
Thank you,
Excellent work.
Jay.
May you go from strength to strength, and good luck dealing with all of the complicated transliteration schemes that you may find in various sites that attempt to empower you. So I'll stick
Thank you,
around for a
Jay.
few minutes, and have a good night. See you soon.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Jay. Appreciate it.
Night.
Thank you.